plenty of time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We do still have people joining us, so they will catch up with us as they join. So good morning. I want to make sure that everyone knows that we are recording all of these sessions. So they will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you would like to ask our presenters or speakers questions during their session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your window. The chat is also available for you all to engage with the speakers as well as the attendees. And finally, I want to ask that you all keep your microphones and your cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with your camera or your microphone being on. All right, so that's all I have. We do still have people logging in, but we're going to get started. So I'm going to hand it over to Becky.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and welcome everyone to our special session, Getting into the Weeds, Fire, Invasive Plants, and Disturbance Interactions. We're going to move right into our first speaker, which is Katie Spellman, who will be talking about fire and invasive plants in Alaska's boreal forest. Take it away.
Good morning from Alaska. I am so excited to see some of your names because I've cited you before, and if we were in person, I'd be asking you for your autograph on a copy of an abstract of a paper you wrote. But sadly, we're playing from all of our homes here. So I work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks on the lands of the Lower Tanana Diné peoples at the International Arctic Research Center. And for us in Alaska, hi Randy, for us in Alaska, invasions in our burned areas is an emergent topic. So just to start off, I've had some wonderful collaborators on this work that I'm about to present. So it's not my own voice, it is the voice of many in this work. And we've had great support from many funders and many programs. So, all right, here in the far north, climate change is the topic. So we have dual increases in fire and in invasive species. Our warmer winters, used to be able to depend on the cold, as our elders say, you could depend on the cold, which was a significant barrier to the establishment of many species from lower latitudes. Our growing season is also lengthening significantly. And this, in combination with our increased fire frequency, severity, and extent, for all the reasons that we all know in this room of why fires are increasing, here in Alaska, it's no different. We are seeing invasive species introductions and success exponentially increase in the boreal forests of Alaska. So we've seen a 46% increase in the number of non-native species in Alaska since our first Flory was written, which wasn't very long ago. It was in the 1940s and 50s that Flory was first compiled. So that's a dramatic shift in our invasive species. We're still at in the exponential growth curve of our invasions. We're still down low in that curve. So prevention is still our best tool here up in the far north. So when you look at the amount of new real estate in Alaska for invasions, it's substantial. And so our boreal, just to orient you here to the map, this is our Brooks Range and this is our Alaska Range. And most of our fires occur within the boreal forest region in between those mountain ranges. However, we have started in more recent years, we have started to get fires in our tundra region, which is unprecedented. The amount of, you look at the boreal forest in Canada, oh my gosh, bam, look at that real estate available. These are the burn perimeters, past 40 years in Canada, boreal forest, similar issues. And our future flammability, this is just a heat map of change in flammability. And you can see our tundra regions here are our future areas of concern for flammability, which is a perhaps creating a perfect storm for invasions in places that here in Alaska, we don't have much capacity to detect them. So we have a very small disturbance footprint, human disturbance footprint in Alaska. There's only a few highways. Anybody that's ever come up here, we have very few highways. Most of our communities are accessible only by small airplane or by boat. And so our detection is really limited. So in 2004, this is the beginning of my story looking at invasives in the boreal forest. In 2004, there was a huge fire season, and the land managers were starting to get worried that we would have this increasing real estate off of the disturbance footprint that we would be unable to detect. So we wanted to prioritize areas to monitor for invasive species. And this is where my research began, with looking at fires and invasive species in the boreal forest. So our main study objectives were to just, what factors do we have any factors that we could use to prioritize which areas to be looking for invasive species in burned areas. So we looked at propagule pressure, we looked at severity, burn severity, which for up here in black spruce, we are defining burn severity as the proportion of the duff layer that has been consumed, since it's, we have these very thick organic layers. And so we used that, especially from the perspective of a germinating invasive plant. That was a very important factor for us up here. We looked at burn age, and we looked at whether small scale controls or large scale controls could be used to prioritize invasive plant management and monitoring. Because invasions throughout the boreal forest are still pretty limited, we had to couple two different approaches. We did a field survey in about 100 established sites that had been established by our long-term ecological research program at Bonanza Creek. And those sites, I'll show you a map in a second. And then we coupled that with a greenhouse experiment where we actually sowed seeds of 3 invasive species families on plugs that we pulled from the burned area. So we were able to control for propagule pressure, but still investigate the effect of that duff layer on the germination of, we chose a grass species, a pea family species, and a sunflower family species to be representative of the taxa that are overrepresented in our non-native taxa in Alaska. So we looked, the Dalton Highway is the road that goes up to our oil fields, and it parallels our oil pipeline in Alaska. So it gets heavy traffic, heavy disturbance. And we selected sites within this to study. And then we looked at a couple other highways in the interior. And we were able to look at whether or not the 3 regions were different and get at that question of scale. To get at the question, and these were all burns from 2004 that we investigated. So in our first question, we controlled for time since burn. In our second question, we used a chronosequence of sites where many of the site factors were controlled for soil type and slope aspect, all those things. We had the chronosequence, so we looked used both the field survey approach and the greenhouse approach there. And then a few years later, where we still had dwindling questions, we did a follow-up systematic survey looking on every highway in interior Alaska, and we stopped every quarter mile in every burn perimeter along all of our highways just to confirm or double check our results from our initial study. So in most places, right, there's so much literature that will suggest that high severity burns are generally more susceptible to non-native plants invasions than low severity burns. So when you think about that, it makes sense. You got decreased competition, you got bare soil from those high severity burns. Lots of people have been finding this in other coniferous forests. In the black spruce forest, we have that giant duff layer, and we found it when we did our field study that invasive plant presence was not influenced by burn severity. It was influenced by propagule pressure, right? It was totally confounded with propagule pressure. So here's our oil pipeline, and there's some Crapus tectorum, which is a little sunflower family plant. It was in the disturbance pathway, and there, it had much greater chance of getting into the burn. When we controlled for propagule pressure, though, the invasive plants grew better in our low severity burn soils. they had the thicker duff, they had more organic soil available. And we noticed when you look at the picture here, look at what's called, so this was 1 year after the fire, and what's colonizing are all these tiny little bryophytes. We have liverworts and mosses just coming in. And the germination, when we sowed the invasive plant seeds on the top in the greenhouse, germination was much lower than in our low severity burns. So we're scratching our heads, right? We're like, okay, maybe this makes sense. And so when we did that comprehensive systematic survey of all burn types, we found across all species that we were looking for in the burned areas, the moderately and lightly burned soils were more likely to have invasive plants dispersing from the roadside into the burned area. But this was a species specific response. So when we looked across all species, moderately and lightly burned had more chances of being infested. But when we looked at like wind dispersed and Mellolotus albus, that was one of our pea family plants, they had different responses to the different burn severities. So one size didn't fit all. We couldn't just say, go look in lightly burned areas, right? We had a grad student follow up on this study. He was really interested, Matt Frey and Xanth Walker. Matt was really interested in the patchiness within burns to see if you could have differences in germination. And he actually did a seeding experiment out in the field, and he got very similar results as us with species-specific responses to charred organic cover, moss cover, and mineral soil cover. And so we started thinking moss is the hero of the boreal forest, right? So your invasion success would be dependent on whether or not you had mosses colonizing. So we wondered, does the species of moss matter? And does the order in which those propagules arrive, if the weed seeds arrive first, or if the moss spores arrive first, whether that would make a difference or not. So we had another student actually do an experiment where he sowed the seeds under the moss layer and above the moss layer, and looked at specific species of moss to see if some were better at protecting the boreal forest from invasion or not. And what he found, so you can see, this is just his graphs, and when he sowed the seeds under the moss, so to imagine that they might emerge from the seed bank through the moss, the germination was suppressed. And then again, he found that the responses were species specific. There were certain combinations of a moss species and an invasive species that were more successful. In particular, he found that sphagnum and this orange hawkweed, Heracea aurantiacum, was a great combination for good emergence through the moss. And so we think that the actual structure of the moss itself, how dense or loose it is, or how much it seals up that bare soil contact for the seed, is a key driver in invasions in the boreal forest. Moss, the hero of the boreal forest, it's like our keystone species, our significant species that's driving our ecosystem processes up here. And then that time since burn question, this is the story is a little more complicated because there's lots of interacting factors with time since burn, right? If your fire interval is short, you might have a different reaction. But
you have about 5 minutes.
Oh, right. And 5 years since burn is a typical pattern in other coniferous forests when it's most invasible. In our black spruce forest, we found the highest richness and abundance in sites that were a little bit older. And we think this is because in all those other studies, there was an established seed bank. And here in Alaska, we don't have an established seed bank within our burned forests. So we are conceptualizing, there's a lot more work to be done on this, but we're conceptualizing our invasibility at this time to be a little bit more delayed than in other places, other regions. We went back after 5 years, and I'm hoping to do this again in the next few years to do a decadal resurvey. But in all the locations where we found invasive plants, no invasives persisted 5 years after we had originally visited. In all those 100 sites in the LTER and in all those quarter-mile systematic survey sites, none were still present. So that gives us hope. So my take-home messages are, number one, know the patterns from the literature, but know your system better, right? And number two, the bryophytes, the mosses, and liverworts are the unsung heroes of the boreal forests. They play a key role in determining site invasibility. And number three, right now, our resistance and resilience to invasion in burned areas seems high still for now. But as Randy will tell you, one of our fire ecologists here in Alaska, things are changing rapidly, both on the invasive species front and our fire front. So we got to stay vigilant, even if we're finding that the resilience and resistance to invasion is pretty high. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Becky.
Well, you are welcome. And thank you for that great talk. I love your comment about know your literature, but know your system better. I wrote that down. I'm gonna have to steal that from you.
Okay, you can.
Awesome. So I am looking here at the, I don't see anything in the WOVA Q&A or the chat. Let's see, one thing I wanted to ask, kind of with these issues in Alaska being a little newer, have you found, that's great because you also, as you mentioned, have the opportunity to do something about invasions when you have them, but sometimes we have a hard time getting traction, like from policy and management kind of stuff. And so what is that situation for you all?
I might ask Randy to unmute too, because she deals a lot with the land managers in Alaska on fire issues. But what we found that, well, I in the interagency fire world, they invite us to give lots of talks about invasives, and the firefighters from the lower 48 that are coming up here are pretty in tune. You know, one of our nightmares is that someone from the lower 48 from down your way, Becky, or down in California, comes up and unrolls their sleeping bag, and there's cheatgrass like in their sleeping bag, and you know, something that we know can grow here, that, you know, if they're at a remote location, we will never find it again. And there we have yeah. So people are trying to be pretty proactive here on the prevention front, but it is a challenge, and we just got to keep talking, I guess, keep talking about it, so that the awareness. Randy, any other thoughts?
Sorry, I can't do the chat. I'm participating via Zoom, but you know, we haven't really been able to find much evidence that so far that fire camps or other you know, firefighting efforts are responsible directly for invasive species, but you know, it certainly behooves us to keep looking.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think let's see, let me look over at the chat here. I don't see anything there or at Q&A.
Becky, I have a quick question. This is Luke.
Sure.
Yeah, so Katie, that's a really interesting talk. I was curious about the decline in invasion over time following the fire, and wondering if it had a lot to do with the certain non-natives that you have right now, and that if you, I guess, fear other invaders that are going to be more competitive once succession goes on after fire, and if you have an idea of what those invaders might be.
Yeah, Luke, you're right. Up here, you know, I don't know if you noticed that the species that we're worried about right now are like the ones that nobody's worried about anywhere else in the world, right? So our big invaders are not heavy hitters. They're not, other places in the world right now. And that, so the student that did that seed bank experiment, Luke Ponciani, he used a species that isn't in our part of the boreal forest yet, where most of the fires are hitting there. It's down on the Kenai Peninsula where fires are starting to increase. But so he used that, and it was able to colonize through the moss And we have a few that are starting to creep into closed canopy forests around Alaska. So like those are the ones we got our eyes on even more now. And I think the ones in the chrono sequence that were occurring were things that just show up in your garden. They also tended to be, Luke, in places where there were stakes from fire ecologists' site plots. So it was the location of the invasives were where people were walking in off of little roads to get to their sites. So
that's super interesting. I think we're going to need to move to the next talk, and maybe we can talk more about this at the end of this session or in the fire circle after this. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Luke Flory. He'll be speaking about plant invasion and drought interact to alter the effects of fire in the longleaf pine ecosystem.
I think Alyssa's next, Becky.
Oh, did I say the wrong thing? I'm sorry, you're right. I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. Alyssa's talking about wildfire and grass invasion under a changing climate in the Hawaiian Islands.
Aloha, my name is Alyssa and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'll be presenting an overview of wildfire in the Hawaiian Islands, but this work is an ongoing collaboration between many groups and people. Wildfire is not typically associated with the Hawaiian Islands, but it's a significant issue that threatens ridge-to-reef health, including forests, coral reefs, biodiversity, human communities, as well as natural and cultural resources. Fire is not endemic to Pacific Islands in general, and most fires in Hawaii occur in dry, non-native grasslands that make up 25% of Hawaii's total land area. And the majority of these wildfires are human-caused. This chart shows that the percentage of total land area burnt in Hawaii is equal to, and sometimes greater than areas burned in the continental United States, including only in Western states. I'll show here some news headlines from the past few years on fires that we've had. Just a few years ago in 2018, there were huge wildfires that burned through the west side of Oahu in Waianae and Makaha valleys, which is seemingly out of place for Hawaii when you look at images like this. Then this was seen again in the year 2019 on the island of Maui. It was all over the news and ultimately over 20,000 acres burned in one summer. And this trend continued into the following year. In 2020, fire burned about 7,300 acres on the island Kaho'olawe, so about 20% of the entire island. And then just this past summer in 2021, there was a really large fire that burned 40,000 acres on Hawaii Island. And this is one of the largest wildfires in recorded history for the Hawaiian Islands and was all over the news. So all of these examples are given to show that wildfire is actually a prevalent feature in our landscapes today. But the surprising thing is that these large, severe fires are not unprecedented, and they're also not restricted to only dry grasslands. In 1901, there was a really large fire on Hawaii Island that burned 30,000 acres and lasted 3 months until rains ultimately extinguished it. This fire started on sugarcane plantation land, but it also burned pasture land and native forests as well. And this quote is from a Hawaiian newspaper, Ke Aloha Aina, and it reads, "There's a large fire destroying the sugarcane fields and forests of Hamakua, and it was intensified recently because of the strength of the wind and the lack of rain." And this quote highlights the knowledge and awareness of fire conditions and that the resources that people worried about at that time are the same things that we're worried about today. These fires have had an impact on Hawaii's history, and I'm currently working on a project with our team to learn more about these historic fires in the Hawaiian Islands. And to do this, I'm specifically looking into the archive of historic Hawaiian language newspapers. The headlines that I showed earlier were from contemporary newspapers just in the past few years, but there's a rich history of literacy in the Hawaiian Kingdom and territory days as well. From 1834 to 1948, over 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language print were published in more than 100 newspapers, making it the largest archive of Indigenous language writing in the Western Hemisphere. In these newspapers, Native Hawaiians documented natural processes that they observed locally, including fires and fire impacts in Hawaii. Although this is a really large repository of knowledge, only a tiny fraction has been included in modern discourse, as it has only recently become digitally accessible and because it's largely in the Hawaiian language. So I'll be using my background in Hawaiian language translation to research fire in this repository to better understand historic wildfires and wildfire perceptions in the Hawaiian Islands and to extend Hawaii's wildfire history. So since that Hamakua 1901 fire, there was annual reporting of area burned. This plot shows that as we come into more recent decades, the area burned is growing much larger. And this indicates that it's important to think about the problem as something beyond fire suppression, because we won't be able to put out really large fires at this scale. We need to be thinking about what's causing these fires in the first place. So here's some fire science to help explain what's going on. On the left side, there's fire behavior, and this is what dictates where and how a fire is going to move across landscape. And this applies to single events as opposed to the idea of fire regimes. Fire regimes are the longer term patterns, and this refers to how climate, ignitions, and vegetation all interact to drive the patterns that we see over time and affect landscape scale patterns. Fire regimes in Hawaii have been altered from infrequent wildfire occurrence prior to human arrival to greatly increased frequency, intensity, and size over the past 100 years. Before human arrival, ignitions were limited to lava flows or infrequent lightning strikes, but since humans arrived, ignitions are almost entirely driven by people. Another key driver of the change in wildfire regimes is the change in vegetation. Fuels associated with invasive species, and particularly the expansion of non-native invasive grasses. And then finally, there are also climatic processes occurring. There are patterns of wet and dry seasons in Hawaii and longer-term El Nino cycles driving Pacific droughts. For ignitions, because prior to human arrival, these were limited to volcanic activity or those really infrequent lightning strikes on land, this means that for Hawaii and other Pacific islands, it was people who brought fire. And there's a clear link between burning and human arrival. And contemporary patterns also show this clear correlation between the number of wildland fire ignitions and the number of people. This is a map showing wildfire incidents for the 6 main Hawaiian Islands. So we can see that fires are occurring mostly where people live, and especially along those roadways. Although ignitions are happening frequently, not all of these become really large wildfires. County fire departments are mostly able to contain them before they grow into large fires over 100 acres. So the locations of these ignitions are connected with people, and there's also this connection with non-native invasive plants dominating these areas. While most wildfires today start in highly invaded ecosystems, these fires do burn into more intact native-dominated ecosystems that may then convert into non-native ecosystems. Since fires are generally not a natural part of Hawaii's landscape, most native plants are not adapted to fire. They have low flammability, and it's difficult for them to regrow after a fire occurs. The primary change in vegetation driving fires has been the widespread expansion of those non-native invasive grasslands. And as those grasslands become more prevalent, you can imagine how much more likely it would be for dry grasses to burn as opposed to a really large native forest. So what this is describing is the grass fire cycle. What you see is a forest adjacent to grassland, and then the grasslands catch fire really easily and they burn into the forests. The native trees burn as they're not adapted to fire, and then the trees die and grasses are able to regrow shortly after, taking up resources and limiting the ability of native plants to establish. That area that was a forest is converted into a grassland, and you get this expansion of the grassland areas. The spread of those grasses then increases the likelihood and size of future fires, and the cycle repeats. So this is eroding our forest edge, and the forests are shrinking as the grasslands are expanding. Now, what's interesting for Hawaii is that Hawaii's big driver of wildfire is actually the decline in agricultural activity combined with all those non-native invasive weeds that are adapted to fire. A big correlation with the increase in fire is the huge decline in agriculture since about the 1960s. And here's a chart of just one example, sugarcane production in Hawaii. And as you can see, there's a dramatic decline in these more recent decades. These abandoned agricultural lands are not being farmed anymore, so there are large expanses of land that are dominated by the non-native invasive grasses, essentially accumulating fuels. And if we look at where the grass cover is in Hawaii, this is also where most of the fires are occurring, especially on the dry sides of the islands. This map shows in green the grass cover, purple is the forest, and the red area is the area burned. And so you can see these burned areas are almost all on the grass covered places. Now, in addition to humans and vegetation, there's also climate to consider. Droughts create dry fire conditions, but heavy rainfall is also important because this causes a lot of grass to grow. And if there's a drought that follows a heavy rain, then there's even more grass fuel available to burn. Here's a map of the mean rainfall in Hawaii, and another complexity of these wildfire drivers is the extreme heterogeneity in climate in different places throughout the islands. The trade winds come from the northeast, and there are dry leeward sides of the islands because of this, and that's where most of the fires occur. The figure on the top right is a drought history for a place called Pu'uva'ava'a on Hawaii Island, showing increasing drought frequency, intensity, and duration over the last 100 years. Then this plot on the lower right shows that the probability of fire as a function of mean annual rainfall split between three types of vegetation: grassland, shrubland, and forests. And the main point is that the grasslands, this tall peak in the light gray color, grasslands are more likely to burn and more likely to be sensitive to rainfall events. As island communities face climate change and continued plant invasion, wildfires are likely to increase. And because Hawaii's ecosystems are not naturally adapted to fire, wildfire damage can be devastating in many ways. Fires, of course, can be dangerous to people and communities. They also cause soil erosion that leads to dust storms affecting air quality and human health. And then after a fire burns, the soil erosion can then run off into the ocean and cause sedimentation that adversely affects coastal health, including reefs, fisheries, cultural activities, and tourism industries as well. And of course, these fires can destroy native forests, increasing the spread of non-native grasses and shrubs, creating that vicious grass fire cycle. So all of these factors with humans, vegetation, and climate pose significant challenges to managing fire and conservation and restoration of endemic biodiversity. A benefit of looking at fire regimes through this model is that it indicates ways that we can intervene and reduce the vulnerability. Since most ignitions are human-caused, education and outreach should be able to help reduce these. And in terms of vegetation, management is a really important tool to reducing risk around our communities and natural and cultural resources. There's been a national effort to address wildfire issues called the Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management. This is a cross-agency effort to address how these different parts go together. And for Hawaii, this means fire-resilient landscapes and fire-adapted communities. So this is a combination of things known to help mitigate fire risk and making that locally relevant, because it's the people in these communities who have that knowledge about resources and the capacity to intervene. Fire resilient landscapes mean things like reforestation efforts, strategic fire breaks, and roadside management, vegetation management, as well as community wildfire protection plans and education and outreach, which is important to inform people, managers, and communities about fire risks. A lot of effort goes into getting communities engaged to know what resources are available in order to stay safe from wildfire. So this was a synthesis of wildfire in the Hawaiian archipelago, which can serve as a model system for better understanding wildfire regimes and dynamics on Pacific Islands more broadly. So the lessons learned from the system may be applicable and relevant to other geographies in the Pacific. Mahalo nui, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alyssa. It was a very interesting, great talk. Gonna look here. So we have a question from John Kim. Is there a strong seasonal pattern to ignitions?
Right, so for Hawaii, it's more of those El Nino events, the seasons. So we have on a daily basis, the fluctuation is different day to day than per season. So not much seasonal difference between like a winter and a summer, essentially.
Great, thank you. Look here for any other questions. One thing I wondered, Alyssa, has there been any wildfire simulation modeling done on the islands to look at patterns and burn probabilities and where fire could go and where like certain treatments might be able to break up fire patterns?
Yes, there has been some modeling done. One of the tricky things is that a lot of the existing models for the continental United States don't really work when you apply them to Pacific Island settings. For Hawaii, there's just so much heterogeneity between the islands in terms of climate and topography. So that's a challenge, but I know that the modeling does exist and usually looked at like for specific areas.
Interesting. Let's see if we have anything coming in. I am not seeing anything else. Let's see. Well, great. We have about 1 minute before the actual talk for Luke. Scared him a little bit there. So we'll just hold on here a minute and thank you, Alyssa. Can still pop a quick question into the chat or the Q&A, anyone out there? And we'll just hold for a sec.
Alyssa, when you've been reading through the historical documents, which I think is a really cool element to your project, have you noticed any other mentions of novel species being introduced?
Yeah, they do talk about that as well. And they'll say, you know, to these people, watch out because this grass is new and it's coming to get your folks soon too. So they do talk about that sort of thing as well. Interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
Thanks.
Well, we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Luke Flory, who's going to be talking about plant invasion and drought interact to alter the effects of fire in the longleaf pine ecosystem.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for organizing this special session, and thanks everyone for being here. So I've been interested in the interactions among multiple global change drivers, including plant invasions and drought. And then here I'm going to talk about how they influence the effects of fire in the longleaf pine ecosystem. So first I want to thank a few people that have been involved in this project, specifically Waylon Dillon and Chrissy Alba, two postdocs on the project, Kathy Fahey, who was a PhD student in the lab, and Drew Hyatt and Gio Tomat Kelly, who were both master's students. So a few years ago, we started talking about this issue of invasive plant fire cycles and the evidence that it was occurring in terms of the complete cycle. And so Gio did a systematic review of the literature and collected all the studies, either anecdotal or empirical studies, of interactions between invaders and fire. And so these maps here show globally the distribution of studies, with the red points showing change in fire and the orange points showing change in fuels for invasive grasses, woody invaders, and invasive forbs. And I'm not going to get too far into the data here, but I want to give you a general idea that, as you might expect, that invaders of different growth habits have differential effects on fuel bed characteristics, including fuel amounts and fuel continuity. The arrows here show increases versus decreases, and they're divided by anecdotal versus empirical studies. And so there's a fair bit of evidence for changes in fuel beds due to invasions, but maybe not quite as much as what you might expect. When we look at fire behavior, including things such as frequency or intensity or size or number of fires, we see similar patterns where different invaders with different growth habits have different effects. And again, most of these are positive effects, some negative effects, which could be due to study biases or other factors. But the main point I want to make here is that collectively, despite the decades of discussion, I would say, on the invasion fire cycle, that there's relatively little evidence that that there's a complete cycle, at least in the literature. And I know there's a lot of people here that are on the ground that see this happening day to day, but we have relatively few empirical studies, despite the fact that Carla D'Antonio and others proposed this dynamic decades ago. So on top of that, an increasing area of research in my lab and elsewhere has been the interaction between climate change and invasions and other global change factors. And so again, over the last couple of decades, people have been emphasizing this issue that there are multiple ecological stressors at work in systems, and that we need to start thinking about how they're interacting with each other. So here in the Southeast US, and specifically in Florida, drought is a significant concern for the coming decades. The number of consecutive dry days and the number of drought events, the severity and the longevity of drought is expected to increase. And this is something that I've found that some people are surprised. Of course, we have a very distinct rainy season, but right now we're in a very dry season. I can't really remember the last time it's rained significantly. It's been at least a month. And those cycles are normal, but they're expected to be more severe and more prolonged. At the same time, of course, Florida is susceptible to non-native plant invasions. It's a hot spot for naturalized plant species. We have a lot of them due to the variety of factors, including the travel and trade, the huge volume of trade that comes through the deep water ports in the state, and the number of people that visit Florida. We have something like 40 million visitors just to the Orlando area each year. Of course, that's pre-pandemic. And then our wide variety of ecosystems and climate. And so a specific invader that we've been working on, kind of a model system, but specifically because, also because it's a major invader that's highly problematic, is Kogan grass, Imperata cylindrica. This is a perennial rhizomatous grass native to Eastern Africa and Southeast Asia. It was both accidentally and intentionally introduced as a forage in Florida and near Mobile, Alabama. It's now widespread throughout a lot of Florida, parts of Mississippi, Alabama, and parts of southern Georgia. So the longleaf pine forest, or the longleaf pine savanna, is the ecosystem that we're most interested in here. This ecosystem was once spread throughout the southeast coastal plain of the United States. That's shown here. The historic range is shown here in purple. The current range is less than 3% of the historic range. It's shown here in red. Due to a combination of factors, primarily change in land use in terms of agriculture, but also due to pests and pathogens. Now, this system has historically been maintained by fire. It's a fire-adapted system, and it was historically a savanna, not so much of a closed canopy forest, but it have very large trees, extremely diverse herbaceous layer, and frequent fire ignited by lightning. Today, most of the management is done with prescribed fire in order to maintain these diverse systems, prevent woody encroachment, maintain high species diversity and ecosystem functions. So we've been interested in the question of how do these interactions between drought and invasion and fire affect the longleaf system. And here on the top, you see a really nice longleaf savanna. And then on the bottom, you see one that's been heavily invaded by kogan grass. So theoretically, we might expect a few different interactions between these different drivers. And here I'm showing the possibilities for drought and invasion, but we could add fire in here as well. And so we might expect that the combination of these factors could be simply additive. So drought plus invasion simply is the sum of the two negative effects shown here, the magnitude of their effects. We also might expect a synergistic interaction where drought plus invasion is actually worse than the combination of the individual effects. Or we could have an offsetting effect where one moderates the other and drought plus invasion is less than the sum of the two. And so we've been addressing this issue with a longer term factorial common garden experiment located here in Gainesville, Florida. And so we have plots that we established. There's 40 plots total. We have a combination of factors. We have rainout shelters and control structures that compensate for the shade and the other microclimate effects of adding the shelter. And then we have plots that have either been experimentally invaded by kogan grass or are uninvaded reference plots. And so we established this experiment in 2012 with a combination of longleaf pine seedlings and diverse native herbaceous species, and then dozens of herbaceous species have colonized from the seed bank and the surrounding area. And in 2013, a year later, we imposed the treatments, the rainout shelters, and the invasion. And so I'm going to provide a little bit of the background data here leading into the fire effects, which we added years later. Okay, so first, the rainout shelter work, it created a simulated drought, about 30 to 50% reduction in soil moisture, which has been more or less highlighted by different types of different seasons. I've highlighted a couple areas here where you can see that in fact the invasion moderates the effect of drought. The drought is shown in the orange triangles, and the red are the invasion plus drought. And so the high density of the invader actually buffers the effect of drought to some degree. In terms of resident plant cover, we see in the ambient plots and in the drought plots, we see the typical seasonal patterns in cover over time. So here we're showing 2014 to 2018. We see a minimal effect of drought, but we see a dramatic effect of the invasion, where the invasion suppresses resident species overwhelmingly across the seasons. In terms of invader cover, we see consistently high invader cover, 40 to 60%, some effect of drought, but it's been fairly minimal. And then I'll note there that in 2018, we had a hard freeze, which temporarily reduced invader cover, but it came back very quickly. In terms of native species diversity, we see a similar pattern, seasonality and diversity over time, some small effect of drought, but a very strong effect of the invasion on native plant diversity or resident plant diversity, with 60% less plant diversity due to the invasion. Okay, so then in terms of the longleaf pine tree, we've seen a fairly interesting and complicated interaction where early on, the moderation of the drought effect by the invasion actually facilitated longleaf pine survival, but over time that shifted to competition as the invader became more abundant. And so just to highlight here, 2013, we see an almost perfect interactive effect of the invasion and drought on soil moisture, which translated to a similar pattern for longleaf pine survival. However, just 4 years later, we still see the moderating effect of the invasion on the drought treatment, but the competition from the invader has resulted in much lower tree survival. Now, the important aspect of the interactive effects of drought and invasion really came out in terms of the fire effect. It really came out in terms of tree height or growth overall. So although we saw lower survival in invaded plots, trees that survived were significantly taller under invasion. And so here, pine tree height on the y-axis over time, we see that under invasion, the blue point here, that they're significantly taller, likely because the shorter trees either died or the remaining trees grew larger in order to avoid the competitive effects of the invader. We did not see a similar dynamic with invasion plus drought because tree height was likely limited by moisture availability. So to get to the fire aspect here, in 2018 and again in 2021, although I'll just show the 2018 data here, we removed all the rainout shelters and the control structures. We installed passive flame height sensors, which are simply cotton string soaked in fire retardant to get a relative measure of flame height. We installed thermocouples at 3 different heights, ground level, 25 and 50 centimeters above ground. And we housed the data loggers in these electrical boxes mounted on the poles within the plots in order to collect data. And there was 9 sensors per plot and 3 flame height sensors installed in each plot. Okay, so what we found then when we did fuel load measurements immediately before the fires is that fuel loads were significantly greater with the invasion as we expected. In fact, 65% greater. We didn't see any effect of the drought, but a really big effect of invasion on fuel load. This resulted in much more dramatic fires. So 4 times taller flames with invasion, which was also greater with greater fuel loads. And then maximum fire temperatures were also higher with invasion and increased with increasing fuel load. And we saw similar patterns for heating duration. As a result, we could immediately see differences in the effects of the fire on the trees. So here you see the scorch height and the invaded compared to the reference plots. And this translated to big differences in tree survival. So this figure is a little bit complicated, but I think the pattern is pretty clear. So this figure shows tree height on the y-axis and flame height on the x-axis. And the first thing you might notice is that the invaded plots shown here in red have much taller flames. And in addition, the trees that lived, shown with the filled symbols, were much taller than the ones that died, shown by the open circles. So altogether, the mortality was about 9% in the reference plots. No trees died under drought alone. About 10% of the trees died with the invasion treatment, but 44% of trees died under the drought plus invasion. So the next thing we did was construct a series of different models in order to draw different inferences from the data. So the first model, we looked at the different possible drivers in terms of the treatments that we had out there. So if we look at survival probability, under average fuel load, trees needed to be much taller with invasion in order to achieve a similar amount of survival. So suggesting that the invader itself, along with the effect of the drought on tree height, is what was driving tree survival in the experiment. Second, when we held tree height constant and just looked at fuel load, we see that invader fuel load, particularly high invader fuel load, significantly reduced survival, but we did not find the similar pattern in the uninvaded plots, the reference plots, simply because the fuel loads, most of the fuel loads were not near as high as with the invaded plots. And then finally, if we hold fuel loads constant in the model under consistently high fuel loads, there's a really strong predicted effect of tree height on survival. So you see much higher survival under this high fuel load when the trees are taller. So really clear evidence for both fuel load and tree height determining whether or not trees survived under the experimental fire. So in terms of management, to achieve something like 35% survival of trees of this size, average fuel loads need to be 1.2 kilograms per square meter or less, and trees must be at least 3 meters tall. Okay, so the take homes here then, first is that in terms of a summary, we found the synergistic effect of drought, invasion, and fire, which occurred because the trees were much shorter under the drought plus invasion treatment. So they were highly susceptible to the tall flames that were generated by the intense fires from the high invader fuel loads.
We have about 5 minutes.
And in terms of management, reducing fuel loads in invaded areas or delaying prescribed fires until trees are beyond the height threshold for mortal fire effects should improve tree survival and management outcomes. And so this could be in terms of overall controlling invasion, or at least controlling an invasion around trees that you're trying to preserve. And then finally, more generally, I think this study highlights the need for these types of longer term manipulative field experiments to understand interactions among multiple ecological stressors and to forecast the outcomes of global environmental change. And then the last thing I want to end on, to kind of come back to that review thing that Gio and I were working on early on, is some research needs that we saw for better understanding the invasion fire cycle. So first, these types of longer term studies, I think, are critical for understanding effects of invader-driven fires on native communities. We see chronosequence type studies, which are fantastic, but oftentimes it's just difficult to disentangle cause and effect. And so I think these studies have a lot of value. Second, I think we need to test the different steps of the invasion fire cycles over an invader abundance gradient. And so, of course, invasions occur at different densities and biomasses over different places, and different populations in terms of genetics are variable and may have variable effects on the invasion fire cycle. And I'm highlighting here our study on Kogan grass phenotypes and phenotypic plasticity and how it varied among different populations of the invader. Third, we think it's important that there's evaluation of relationships among climate, ignitions, resource availability, and crop fuel pressure. And that's been highlighted by the two talks that we just saw in this session and talks over the last couple of days. And then finally, we think there need to be more tests of the effects of altered fire regimes on native species emergence and competition among species, kind of that last step of the invasion fire cycle, or the third step. And here I'll highlight a paper that we had just come out in Journal of Applied Ecology a few months ago. This was part of Gio's master's, where she looked at different invader fuel loads and how they affected native species by increasing fire intensity and soil heating, but in fact didn't affect the invader. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was a great talk. Gonna pull up the chat questions here. Okay, a question from Claire Tortorelli. Really interesting talk. Has any work been done on investigating the interacting effects of drought and invasion on post-fire longleaf recovery at regional scales, e.g. leveraging remote sensing?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't think so. We, as part of a larger study with some people where we're looking at climate change effects on southern pine forests and the effects of invasion and fire, there's some modeling being done. So this is with Mike Dietz at Boston University that does a lot of ecological forecasting work. And that incorporates remote sensing data, but I'm not aware of specific empirical data to get at that question, Claire. That's a good question, though.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I have anything else here. I'm not seeing anything. Claire says thank you. Check over here. We have just about a minute left.
Looks like Katie has her hand up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Katie.
Luke, I was just curious if the fire treatment was an afterthought. Were you like, oh, we got this great drought experiment and like, let's burn it, or was it by design from the beginning?
Yeah, it was, I guess, somewhere in between. I mean, we had fire in mind the entire time because the system is fire adapted and fire is very common. There's a lot of restoration work done on longleaf, and it's always the question of when you can get fire in there and how you can get it to carry and how do you get it to not be too severe and maintain survival of trees that you want to keep and keep out woody species, that sort of thing. And we actually try to prepare the site initially with fire, but there had been some major wildfire issues in the area of the year we were trying to set the experiment up, so we couldn't do that. So it was somewhere in between. It was a big effort to take all the shelters down, and we've done it twice now and then rebuilt them. So yeah, so the longer term data is going to be really interesting. Is interesting on the herbaceous community because we have 8 years of data now and 2 fire events.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke. We're going to move on to our next speaker, which is John Kim, who will be talking about wildfire, plant invasion, and future climate change results from wildfire simulation. Go ahead, John.
All right, thank you very much. My name is John Kim. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service, and this work represents really a big collaboration with lots of people who are all listed here. These are my collaborators and co-authors. We are working on running fire simulations in the Blue Mountains ecoregion, which is a heavily invaded ecosystem. This is located in eastern Oregon, mostly. And the middle panel here shows what the invasion looks like when you have Ventonata invade a site. And then in the right panel is sort of what it looks like at the landscape scale, what the invasion looks like. And the model that we're using is FSIM Large Fire Simulator, developed at Rocky Mountain Research Station. Briefly, it represents the landscape as a grid, something ranging in the 120 to 270 meter resolution. And then, so you create a whole bunch of grid layers that represent the landscape, including fuel models. And then the fire model itself is kind of a Monte Carlo style simulator where it simulates fires daily over 365 days, but then it does that it repeats it 10,000 times, 10,000 years. And every day there could be ignition and growth of a fire, and then the application of a suppression algorithm. So you run the model for 10,000 years, and then you get a gridded output showing where the fires have been and fire probability or burn probability per grid cell and various fire behavior metrics. So our modeling process is a little complex. The overall goal is to get to a point where we can simulate fire regime for a future time period. We are targeting mid-century, centered around 2050, and end century as a kind of a secondary goal. And so to do that, we want to do that in two ways. We want to create a future fuelscape representing the future fuel conditions. And we want to have two sets of simulations, one set representing climate change only, and then another set representing change in fuelscape and climate change. And it's kind of a multi-step process. We've got, we're running present day simulations, and then we're working on creating mid-century climate conditions, which we do that by generating ERC, energy release components for each of 5 selected GCMs. And then we're working on creating mid-century landscape, mid-century fuelscape by taking outputs from a species distribution model that we have and some remote sensing work that we have done, and then combining that with vegetation model output from MC2 DGVM to try to estimate what the fuel conditions might be like, or what the fuelscape, what the vegetation landscape might be like in the future. So we combine all of that and create a future fuelscape, and then we feed that into the FSIM model for the mid-century. Creating a future fuelscape is kind of one of the goals of the study, and it's a rather complicated process. But broadly speaking, we're in the process of running the MC2 DGVM to create kind of transition, a conceptual model of transitions from present day landscape to the future landscape. And then we apply that to the existing fuelscape that we have for the Blue Mountains ecoregion. And then for the that invasion portion of the fuelscape, we take a map of scabland map of where those invasions are possible, and then we apply to that a climate envelope model, an SDM, species distribution model, to estimate where within those scablands the invasions are likely to happen. So we combine those two things to create a future fuelscape. For now, we have primarily a set of intermediate future projections, and those comprise ERC projections for the future. And ERC is what drives the primary weather stream that goes into the FSIM fire model. So this is a pretty strong representation of what we expect to see out of the actual fire models. And we have some preliminary results from an FSIM run in the end that I can share with you. But for this portion of the talk, I'm going to focus on the ERC projections. So in this kind of gridded layout here, what we have are seasonal projections of ERC for that compares today, mid-century, and end-century conditions for many GCMs. So each little plot represents the future based on a GCM. And along the x-axis, we have months of the year. So the big bumps you see in the middle are, is basically the summer, the fire season. And on the y-axis, we have the average months where the ERC exceeds the number of days that exceeds 80 percentile ERC. And 80 percentile is important because that's what FSIM uses to ignite fires and to spread fires within the model. So the dotted line is the observed present day conditions. The kind of yellow orange line is the end century according to that GCM, and then the solid line is the mid-century. So for many of the GCMs, the mid-century and end centuries are similar, while for others, they're very different. So for example, right in the middle of the grid here, we have GFDL ESM2M, where the yellow line is very different than the solid black. And that just means that the end century conditions are projected to be very different than mid-century. The X's, the red X's and the green check marks represent GCMs that have been evaluated to have high skill for the Pacific Northwest region, and the X's are the poor skills for the PNW region. And these are the green check marks are the top 5. The red X's are the bottom 5. These are very rough, ways to kind of gauge the GCMs. It's not on a be all and end all. I would not rule out or throw out a single GCM based on these metrics. So one of the interesting patterns that we see is that when you look at the change in precipitation that come out of the GCMs, there are a high number of the GCMs that project actually a significant increase in precipitation for this ecosystem during the summer. And on this graph, we have projected change in precipitation as percentage of present day precipitation. So you kind of have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, since this is a very Mediterranean ecosystem. So in the summers, it's quite dry. There's not a lot of rain in the summer. So even a small increase in terms of millimeters of rain can result in a high percentage change. However, a number of GCMs do project an increase in summertime precipitation, and the ones that are listed here, that are labeled here, such as Canny SM2, CSIRO, FIO, MPI, they're not necessarily the best performing GCMs nor the poorest, but nonetheless, a high number of them are projecting an increase in summer precip. And the way that's important for fire modeling is that even a small sprinkle can really dampen the ERC signal. So what then happens in the FSIM model is that that can really suppress at least simulated wildfire driven by those GCMs. There are a number of GCMs that appear to have early summer increase in ERC. So I've highlighted them with green boxes here. And a lot of them are not necessarily poor performing GCMs. So that seems like a distinct possibility. There are a number of GCMs with mid to late summer increase in ERC. So they, when you drive FSIM with these GCMs, it's bound to have produce much more fire activity during the fire season. And then there are a number of GCMs that interestingly project little change in ERC in both mid-century and end-century. So those are, even without running FSIM through with these GCMs, we can already guess that they're going to have probably fairly small changes in simulated fire activity going into the future. And then there are a number that actually simulate some decrease in ERC during the fire season. And that's a kind of a curious thing. So the next thing that we did was we plotted the seasonal precipitation patterns that are coming out of these GCMs. And these are all the same graphs, but they're just colored differently where each set of GCMs with the parent seasonal patterns are colored differently. So for example, in the top left panel, we have green lines representing GCMs that appear to have early summer increase in ERC. And then in the top right, we have GCMs that have mid to late summer increase in GRC. And the seasonal patterns don't really pop out very strongly. It appears to me that on the left side, those that have early summer increase in ERC, they seem to have a bit of a decrease in the precip in the early summer months, whereas with the GCMs that have mid to late summer increase, there seems to be a suppression of precipitation in those late summer months. But visually the signal is a little bit weak, and I think the really interesting details can be shaken out if we look at the actual distribution of the daily, the day-to-day distribution of precipitation patterns, and we have not quite gotten to that point. We have run FSIM for mid-century for one GCM, and the reason why this has taken so long is because FSIM simulations take an incredible amount of time, especially in fire-prone areas, because so many fires and fire spread is simulated. So this is an exploratory run that simulated just 1,000 years, and this took probably about a month on a brand new Windows server machine.
You have about
Um,
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So on the left side is the historical baseline. In the middle is the map showing the burn probability, the annual burn probability of the mid-century, and then on the right is the difference. And so you can see on the right panel that there are many areas where fire is projected to increase fairly significantly, and then some places where it is projected to decrease. And this is a GCM where the ERC is projected to increase fairly robustly across all months of the fire season. And at the bottom right, I made a histogram of the changes, and it's kind of a normal curve centered right around 0, a little bit to the right of the 0. So there are a number of pixels where fires the probabilities increase and then probabilities decrease. We took a look at how those changes in annual burn probability are distributed by elevation, and it appears that the strongest increases happen sort of at the mid elevations where there is a kind of a moist and dry forest within the ecosystem. And at this point, that sort of makes sense that with a warming climate, the fire is going to intensify in where there's a lot of fuel in these mid elevation forests. So some of our preliminary results are that climate change is likely to increase fire activity in the region based on our ERC analysis. There is a strong possibility that at least in this modeling approach that precipitation increase in the summertime may mitigate some of the warming in temperature. But that just all total precip does not tell the whole story. We have to look at the precipitation, the daily precipitation patterns. And then we're excited to to look forward to some ensemble simulation results. We plan on doing at least 5 GCMs for the mid-century, and then we'll be exploring, comparing and exploring how the change in climate alone it contrasts to change in climate and fuels. And then we'll be gauging how things vary across the GCMs. Again, this is a hugely collaborative effort relying on lots of models and modeling history and knowledge and different data sets. So we thank all of the people that we rely on. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Interesting talk. Let's see what we have going on out here. Not seeing too many questions posted yet. So if folks have questions for John, go ahead and post. John, I wanted to just clarify that kind of what you showed today just has like you're using those future ERC values to drive FSIM, but we still have the current landscape. So we haven't yet added what the future invasion can look like. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's actually in the works. I think that, well, based on we've done a set of simulations for the present day conditions, and that has shown that when you compare uninvaded and invaded landscapes, there is a significant change in the fire regime, not just simulated fire regime, not just in the invaded parts of the landscape, but also in the adjacent uninvaded parts. So fire, it could alter fire regimes, beyond the invaded landscape. So my hypothesis is that we're going to see something like that, but even amplified further, because the intensification of the fire activity by a warmer, in many cases, a warmer and drier climate.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Very interesting. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is actually I am giving the last talk, so I'm just gonna share my screen here. All right, hopefully folks can see that. Looks like it's pulling up here. I'm going to be talking about barriers to building resilient forest landscapes in the presence of weeds. And just for those of you who might be joining this session, just for this talk, I'm Becky Kerns. I'm with the Forest Service Research Station in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm also the principal investigator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. And the co-authors on this talk are Claire Tortorelli at Oregon State University, as well as Janine Cretin at Oregon State University, who's the administrative director of the Northwest Fire Science Consortium, as well as Jeannie Montblanc from the Great Basin Fire Exchange at the University of Nevada, Reno. So before I get too far in, I just wanted to introduce you all a little bit to the Joint Fire Science Exchange Network system, because this talk is kind of an effort among a couple of those exchanges. About 10 years ago, the Joint Fire Science Program created the Fire Exchange Network, and it's a national collaborative. There's 15 regional fire exchanges that basically provide the most relevant and current wildfire science information to a variety of stakeholders in these regions. Their objective is to really bring fire management information to users, practitioners, and to address regional fire management needs and challenges. And because these needs and challenges are regional, they have these regional exchanges. And so the Northwest Fire Science Consortium covers most of Oregon and Washington, with the rangeland area in Oregon being covered by the Great Basin Fire Exchange. So I'm sure many of you know that there's a lot of focus in our drier forests in the Western US, our drier frequent fire forests like ponderosa pine, on creating resilient forests through active management. So in a nutshell, this usually means some sort of conifer density management to reduce tree density, woody fuels and ladder fuels, and then through something like thinning, or the combination of a thinning and prescribed fire. Reintroducing fire is with prescribed fire is a major goal. And the intent is to reduce those fuels, diversify the forest, and create resiliency to future disturbances. Management for forest resilience is pretty successful at meeting some of those basic goals in terms of fuel reduction, but it also creates some problems for weed invasion. You're opening up canopies, you're creating soil disturbance, and you might actually be introducing propagules. So there has been challenges with implementing these kind of treatments in areas where we do have weeds, so that we don't exacerbate or introduce weed populations. And I've been involved kind of over the past decade or more with a lot of folks in the management community, weed specialists, botanists, range conservationist folks that really detail how complex it is, and just challenges across multiple, from implementation, social and policy challenges, to kind of designing treatments to prevent the spread of weeds. When, I think I have, so this is a site, this is a Western juniper site down in Southern Oregon on the Fremont Wainema. And it's a classic kind of question. This site is being was being scheduled for conifer density management, so thinning and removing the juniper trees. And so the question is, will this relatively healthy understory site be invaded by annual grasses after the juniper is removed? There are invasive annual grasses just, a couple hundred meters away from this site. So fire managers are concerned about the risk due to the dense juniper, the fire risk, the risk for crown fires, and they need to treat a certain amount of acres. But then Other folks are concerned about weed invasion. Range folks usually want to remove something like juniper or ponderosa pine to kind of increase forage, but they also don't want invasive species to come in, because then it kind of doesn't really get that high quality forage that they want. So we've been working with managers to try to better integrate fuel and weed management. Several years ago, in association with some funding we got from the Joint Fire Science Program for our Ventonata work, we conducted a series of workshops, which we called Listen and Learn. These were basically going out to district offices and talking to folks about issues they were dealing with. And our intent was to really kind of try to create a dialogue and some shared understanding. But we found that we really weren't reaching the fire and fuel specialists that we were hoping to kind of be part of this integrated discussion. So in essence, a lot of times it was like preaching to the choir. There was good work going on, but we felt that we needed to kind of think about a different approach. So about a year ago, we decided to work with the fire science networks to see if we could move forward in a different way to really explore what we could do about some of the frustrations that we were hearing about in the field. So, oh, sorry, I think I went 2 slides ahead. So what we did when we partnered with the Great Basin Consortium, as well as the Northwestern one, was to kind of, our goals were to develop an integrated interdisciplinary approaches to stewardship and move beyond competing or disparate silos, kind of the botanists and the weed specialists on one side and the fuel managers on the other. And another goal was to really facilitate solutions and roadmaps, and then identify information gaps and try to develop useful tools that could help guide implementation. And the way we decided to do this was to conduct some structured dialogues. And so this was somewhat similar to the listen and learn approach, but we decided to include some folks a bit higher up in the leadership chain and gain insights on how to move forward and not just talk about the issues that were going on in the field, but to really move into like what we can do about it. So that was our first step, was to meet with what we call the ologist community, people like weed specialists and botanists. And then our next step, once we kind of have a framework around that, and some really action items moving forward with that, will be to meet with the fire management community. And so we haven't done that second step yet, so I'm just mostly talking about that first step. So there were a lot of barriers that were kind of reiterated that we kind of used as a starting point. We didn't want to rehash everything that had been talked about over many, many years. But we also needed to have kind of a framework around like what are the solutions we're looking at. People talked about misconception, issues around having people think that fire actually always controlled weed invasions, rather than having fire sometimes exacerbate weed invasion. Loss of weed-focused targets was another issue that was raised consistently, along with the dominance of fuel reduction, woody fuel reduction related targets. Lack of resource integration, and kind of thinking that weeds are really just rangeland issues and not really a forest issue. There was a desire to actually implement existing policies. We do have some existing policies, they just aren't always implemented. Things like leadership awareness. And then the issue that weeds are a fuel problem too. A lot of folks, particularly in the Forest Service, are less familiar with things like the grass fire cycle and the influence of these species that they can have on fire regimes. So these were some of the barriers that were raised and that we wanted to develop some action items around. And so we kind of focused on a few things, and that's education and the need for shared understanding and education about weed issues. And this included ideas about bringing weed issues into fire training. And and covering both ecological and fuel issues. And that what we decided to do is to develop a tool. And we developed an infographic. And then the idea is that we're going to use this infographic to facilitate discussions and feedback with fire managers, and then also hopefully use this infographic in some training, like being able to bring it to conferences like AFE and talk to folks about it to reach more of that fire and fuel management community. So we built this infographic, and this is a wonderful art that Lael Gilbert did for us at the Great Basin Fire Exchange. And I know it's a little small to see, so I've got it kind of unpacked in the next few slides for you. And at the top, we started out just with a quick description of the problem, that woody fuel treatments can increase weeds, going over some of those mechanisms that I talked about earlier. And then we have a section on impacts, both ecological and fire, and a lot of the infographic is focused on that. Challenges across different facets, and then tackling the problem. So looking at that impact section, a lot of folks were familiar with kind of the ecological impacts, but we focused in on impacts to biodiversity and ecosystem function, like wildlife habitat, forage for livestock, erosion, things like that. The section on fire impacts was something we really spent a lot of time on, trying to kind of display some really simple graphics around. So we talk about, how these invasive species, particularly things like annual grasses, can dry out quickly in the summer. This makes ignition really easy. It shifts the fire season earlier. So, and we also have our increase in fine fuels and this kind of fuel continuity in areas where we have a lot of invasion, and how this can increase fire spread rates across landscapes, and how this can actually, this really rapid fire spread rate can decrease your fire response time. And of course, the potential to increase fire frequency as weeds recover really quickly. Also, when you have a lot of weeds on the ground in areas, if you have any ignition, you're probably going to have a fire. It's a lot easier to set a field of something like cheatgrass on fire than it is to set, an individual tree on fire, or get an ignition in a forested system. I'm all over the place, all over the map here. Challenges. So we focused on policy implementation and social challenges. So kind of going over some of those things that I talked about earlier, the lack of weed-focused management targets, fund availability, limited resource integration among specialists during project planning. One thing also folks talked about, limited seed resources and species for post-fire restoration efforts. The fact that in terms of these social challenges, that weeds aren't uniformly viewed as a fuel and fire problem, especially in forests. And that weeds aren't usually viewed as a major problem until they're really widespread. And then, as we all know, they're a lot more difficult to control and eradicate. So our tackling the problem section of the infographic kind of focuses on this how we can work together to more effectively manage these problems together, and that weed management is really needs to be part of building resilient forest landscapes. So planning and embracing policies together, setting quantifiable weed targets, that funding piece, investing in weed management, looking for options for flexible funding, increasing options for post-fire seed resources, and performing targeted weed research. And that was, identified as a challenge and barrier, that we don't always have the science that we need. And then spreading the word, just like that awareness and shared understanding piece with effective education, and sharing science from the local to the leadership level. So our next steps, as I mentioned, are going to be to kind of start having some dialogues more with the fire and fuel community using this infographic, as kind of our core piece. And yeah, that is kind of where we are. And so I am happy to, I have to moderate myself here, so sorry, I'm gonna go ahead and look to see if we have anything going on in the Q&A or the chat. I see a third question. Okay. Great work, thank you. Curious if you could say more about challenges and barriers with agency policies and engaging leadership. This is something that we're interested in from the NISC and with like perspective. Yes, thank you for your question. This is something that like, that has just been really frustrating for a lot of folks about, particularly in the Forest Service, we have a lot of policy emphasis on woody fuel management and woody fuel treatment. And so that's a challenge, that's a policy challenge. When we talked to folks, there was a lot of interest in trying to talk more with leadership, having these issues be more salient for leadership. Really, you know, folks kind of really wanted us to go out and start talking to regional leadership and FLTs and ELTs and all of that. And so that's the, you know, the regional leadership teams. And so that's kind of something that we've had a hard time wrapping our head around, because we agree with the issue, but it's kind of hard just to insert yourself into some of these leadership groups. And so we have pondered the best way to do that. And so I would really be interested in thinking about tools and partnerships with NISC and the with like partnership. Oh dear, I'm sorry. So yeah, I would be very interested in that. Hopefully we can maybe talk about that at the fire circle a little bit coming up next. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. I'm gonna see if we have anything else going on. I wanted to leave a few minutes here to just open up to any other questions we might have for any other speaker. And then there also there was a request to talk about what we might do with any sort of follow-up publications from this special session. So if we don't have any questions from the audience, which I don't, okay, I see something else here. Love the infographic, spot on for some information and range lines. Will you be talking with leadership in the fire community? Yes, we hope to do that. That's what we're going to try to do with our facilitated dialogues. We have pushed much of the same discussion and has heard from folks on the ground, but the policies and funding allocations don't recognize the role of weeds and is still severely hampered often. Yeah, I hear you. And we are interested in really having those larger discussions with leadership. And we're also interested in any folks who might want to collaborate with us on that across different regions. Okay, so I think that's all I have from the WOVA Q&A and chat. So I don't know if the speakers would like to take a couple minutes here and talk a little bit, just a minute or two, on ideas for moving forward with publication. If anyone wants to unmute. And I do want to mention that there is the book that Matt Brooks and I are going to be working on, kind of updating. I don't know if folks went to the special sessions that Matt Brooks organized on kind of the state-of-the-art synthesis around invasive plants and fire. There is going to be a state-of-the-art book produced. And so there's opportunities to collaborate and be part of that. And that's what the fire circle that starts in 20 minutes, there's going to be discussion around that. So folks are welcome to to attend that. But are any of the speakers specifically interested in coming up with either separate papers or something synthetic out of the special session that we had today and yesterday, are getting in the weeds?
It seems, one of the emergent themes across the talks was kind of the interaction between key species and climate/drought and fire. And we have lots of examples of those like amplifying feedbacks that Luke is probing deeper into, right, Luke? But I think an example of feedback loop that might be a more regulating feedback would be the example from here in Alaska. So just like, we have a resilience building or a resistance building feedback loop that might be an interesting, hopeful example in contrast to the amplifying feedback loops like in Florida and Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Katie, it was really interesting how, and what a stark contrast the situation is there, right? I'm sure there are numbers on it, but like the biomass accumulation over time across a growing season or across a year, since our growing season is so much longer, it must be orders of magnitude different. And then you have a lot of native, persistent, competitive, species that result in these what look like super wimpy invaders to somebody in Florida. We have 15-foot tall shrubs and these perennial grasses with roots that are whatever meters deep and rhizomes and just like incredibly competitive invaders. And I just wonder, because I think a lot about the context of invasion and the characteristics of the invaders. And I just wonder if there are invaders coming that will not make your system look quite so resilient, unfortunately. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Everyone, I apologize that I have to cut us off. We have,
Yeah.
Maybe we can do another minute before we need to end this session. So
Okay. Well, maybe I can just see, would folks be in? What I can do is I can send out an email to all the speakers, and maybe we can find a time to have like a discussion about how we want to move forward. And if folks can attend the fire circle, get a little more perspective around what's going to be covered in that book, and where we might have a nice niche to complement or do something different. I would be interested in continuing to try to herd the cats along that, herd us cats. That sound like a plan?
Sure.
I know Alyssa and I are not joining through Hoover, so if you have a Zoom link to the fire circle.
To the fire circle?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let me send it. I thought it got sent to our session. Okay. That will involve me firing up my Forster's email, which will probably make me crash. That's what happens.
You can still go to Hoover. You can still go to Hoover and
participate.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, you'll just be an attendee rather than but you should be able to ask questions and dialogue and stuff.
Is the fire circle on a different Zoom link?
Yeah, you need to go back to the conference and go to the agenda and find it. It starts at well, for us, it starts at 10. So probably 1 o'clock on the East Coast. I'm not sure where you are, Adam, but yeah, if you go into the agenda, you should be able to just find it and click on it.
I got some instructions for you, Adam. I'm going to wrap us up. I just want to thank all of our speakers for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate you all. This session will be available in Hoover, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. So up next, we've been talking about some of the sessions coming. We have 2 general sessions and then 4 special sessions and 2 fire circle discussions sessions. So you have a lot of choices. To choose the one you would like to join, use the agenda tab on the left of your screen and click sessions, and then click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, Be sure to select the session titled Advances and Challenges for Indigenous Fire Stewardship. Thank you again to all our speakers, and we will see you all soon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.